Good afternoon. On behalf of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, I extend a very, very warm welcome to all those who are present. Um, we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Uttam Sinha, who is currently fellow at IDSA and who is former senior fellow at NMML. The topic of today's lecture, and he has done his research on this subject in Nehru Memorial also, is Indus Waters Treaty negotiation period 1952 to 1960. We all know that this Indus Water Treaty, in some way, is a consequence of the partition of the subcontinent, which created a situation in which these six rivers of northwestern India, starting from Satluj, Vyas, Ravi, and Jhelum, Chenab, and Indus, their waters needed to be divided between India and Pakistan. And the process had started soon after the partition. And from what I know, it was in 1952 that the World Bank entered the picture. And after 8 years of negotiation, as Dr. Sinha is going to discuss, ultimately the Indus Water Treaty existence in 1960. And the treaty gave the water of the three western rivers, Jhelum, Chenab, and Indus, to Pakistan, and the three eastern rivers, Satluj, Vyas, and Ravi, to India. And naturally, the water of the three western rivers is much larger in volume, probably two or three times, as compared to the eastern rivers. So it is widely perceived that the treaty is unfavorable to the interests of India. And as I said, that Dr. Sinha has studied this topic during his fellowship here, and he has done an in-depth study of the subject. So we would really be very, very interested in hearing his views on this subject. And I must say that his he is otherwise also, you see, a leading commentator on transboundary water issues, climate change, and on the Arctic region. So, without any further delay, now I would like to once again welcome Uttamji and also invite him to proceed with his lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra, for your kind introduction. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I must, at the outset, acknowledge my appreciation to the Nehru Memorial Museum Library for hosting this public lecture. And in the same breath, let me express my regret for not being in person for the talk. I'm nursing a slight flu and just being a little careful. Indeed, as the chair mentioned, I truly value my 2-year stint at the NMML, and I regard myself as very privileged, and my stint was extremely enriching. The negotiation period 1952 to 1960 on the Indus Basin was a defining time in India-Pakistan relations. And throughout history, we observe that the Indus Basin has been very territorial, highly political, extremely emotive, and dangerously divisive. So it hardly comes as a surprise that the basin, the Indus Basin, underwent intense negotiations to the point of breaking down on several occasions before eventually the Indus Waters Treaty was signed in Karachi on September 19, 1960, with Ayub Khan, Pakistan's chief martial law administrator, Jawaharlal Nehru, the democratically elected India's prime minister, and the World Bank as the third party, represented by its vice president, Sir William Illief. Now, some of the questions that emerge are as follows, and I will delve into these questions in my talk. Was it inevitable and inescapable, especially since the land was partitioned in 1947? Hence, the rivers needed to be partitioned? This is the first question. The second question is, how and why did Pakistan and India agree to share the waters of the Indus rivers? Remember, there was this acrimonious period post-partition on the water sharing. So between 1952 to 1960, we have to consider and see what were these convergences that brought India and Pakistan together to eventually sign a treaty. The third question to consider would be, where the principles of water rationality and pragmatism greater than the divisive politics that prevailed post-partition? The next question to delve into would, of course, be the World Bank role. And we know that it's been an important third party in the whole negotiating process. But more importantly, what was in the mediation that made the difference, or what were the incentives of settlement? That also poses a very interesting question. But to me, and being a student of international politics, what really fascinates me is the prevailing international order that influenced the negotiations. Now, it is well known that the US goal in the early 50s and most part of the 50s was to persuade both India and Pakistan to join its camp in order to free South Asia from Soviet communist influence. And this is something I'll delve into. And lastly, and probably as a critique, did India give away more water to Pakistan than necessary? And I think this is a question that continuously haunts us even today. Did this so-called generosity carry a political objective and a certain economic outcome? As Nehru, during the time of the heated debate in Lok Sabha over the treaty in November 1960 said, it is the context that we have to consider, not a particular bit. If so, was India able to achieve it? And this is a question that keeps recurring when we examine the Indus Waters Treaty. Now, I would obviously attempt to examine this stated period of negotiation, 1952 to 1960, through these questions. But the negotiations themselves are difficult to understand without the historical context to it. And my first historical context is the Punjab Boundary Award. Now, the award principally kept the division and demarcation of the borders on the basis of religious demography and settlement maps. But it had to continuously contend with other factors, especially the canals and the rivers in the Punjab. The interpretation of the other factors, and there's a whole lot of documents one can read through, saw a lot of heated exchanges between ML Setalwad and Zafarullah Khan, who were the legal counsels in the Boundary Commission, in the Punjab Boundary Commission. And the former, Setalwad, had argued that while the demography was undoubtedly a principal factor for demarcating the boundary, other factors, including the physical features, were not subsidiary, but equally important. Now, Setalwad thus, emphasized and argued for the boundary to be pushed as far west along the course of the Chenab River. That would include Lahore and Sheikhupura and the canal colonies of Lailpur and Montgomery districts. On the other hand, Zafarullah Khan gave very little importance to the other factors and argued consistently for the numerical majority of the Muslims in the tehsils. Zafarullah's demand was for West Punjab a certain boundary that extends up to Chenab, right? Now you had also Harman Singh, who pleaded for a Sikh homeland between the Beas and the Chenab, which included the canal colonies that the Sikh had toiled hard to make it very prosperous. While the Bikaner and the Bhavalpur states made claims for retention of the Firozpur headworks in East and West Punjab respectively. Now all these three dominant communities, the Sikh, the Muslim and the Hindus, had their own concerns and demands. But what was common was the rivers Rivers was a reference point to the Punjab Boundary Commission. Cyril Radcliffe, the architect of the Boundary Commission, clearly could not really grasp the complex hydrology that the rivers presented. Remember, he was a lawyer, and he was a good one, of course, but he was not a cartographer, and he was certainly not a hydrologist. And therefore, from time to time, he would wear his legal hat and consider, especially these intensive irrigation system in the Punjab, to come under a joint control of both the sides. And in fact, in one of his notes, and I can quote that note, he says, "I find it difficult to envisage a satisfactory demarcation of boundary that is not accompanied by some arrangement for joint control of the intake of the different canals dependent on these headworks." I think this was an interesting observation, but both Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Jawaharlal Nehru completely dismissed it. In fact, Jinnah very angrily responds to this proposal and says he would rather have Pakistan deserts than fertile fields watered by courtesy of Hindus. And Nehru, equally angrily, responded to Radcliffe saying, what India did with India's rivers was India's affair. So I think this is an important context when you look at the 1952 to 1960 negotiation that started. The next historical context would be the partition itself. The partition was a very exhaustive process from a very administrative perspective. The administrative consequences of partition, which you would recall Mountbatten presented to the Congress and the Muslim League leaders on June 3, 1947, exposed the enormous material implications and the associated complexity of dividing the country of all its assets and liabilities. And as it said, right down to the typewriters. Now, the Indus Basin was regarded as one of the most homogeneous physiographic regions on earth, with the western rivers, that is the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, and the eastern rivers, Satluj, Bear, and Ravi, became politically divided between two new sovereigns, India and Pakistan. And this had never happened in the entire history, the long, long history of the Indus Basin. We had the emergence of two new sovereigns. Now, before the partition, the basin was divided amongst a number of provinces and princely states. And it had a set of quasi-international law that governed the distribution of water. And despite the various principles that was framed, the competition for water remained quite unabated. Disputes and competition, I think, is a very integral part of the Indus Basin. And it was only expected to be so between India and Pakistan. And this was clearly reflected in the negotiations that happened. By the time of the partition, the Indus system of rivers, and this is very important, irrigated more land than any other river system in the world. About 37 million acres of irrigated land. That's what the Indus Basin is all about. And of which 31 million acres, which is almost equivalent to the total irrigated area of the United States, went to Pakistan after the partition. And very little, about 5.5 to 6 million acres came to India. But what was important about this entire basin was it had the potential to irrigate an additional 46 million acres of land. And that was the great value of the Indus Basin. And that is why the enormous amount of interest that was imposed on the rivers that make the basin. Now, as the new international boundary cut across the basin, a new geography emerged, giving the upper reaches of the Indus Basin and its western and eastern tributaries to India, while the lower reaches came to Pakistan. The new frontiers set forth new political conditions. The administrative provisions, which was hitherto available for lower basin provinces to seek remedies against upper provinces, and that existed in the British colonial time, ceased to exist as two new sovereigns were born. Thus, probably one of the first questions that the new government of Pakistan faced was very riparian in nature. What would not a hostile India do? For India, and more specifically for East Punjab, the main question was to establish claim of the waters in its territory before downstream utilization became a prospective right. It was important for India, therefore, to develop several million acres of what is called semi-arid but otherwise very fertile lands in the Indian part of the Indus Basin. It had also to contend with migration of a large population from the canal irrigated areas of West Punjab and Bawalpur. So water became, I think, for both India and Pakistan, very central to sovereignty. And very interesting upstream, downstream dynamics emerged based on new geography and absolute control of water that India viewed. What Pakistan sort of articulated was the status quo or the prior appropriation. In other words, the historical uses of water that Pakistan claimed. For Pakistan, any curtailment of its existing uses of water was seen as an attack on its sovereignty. The Indus Basin, from its very inter-provincial dynamics which existed in the pre-partition period, became one of interstate competition, and thus potentially a flashpoint and a tinderbox. What about the political leadership during the time of the partition? I think Jinnah had no clue about the hydrological disadvantage that Pakistan would face. And there are no evidences, and I looked around for such, to suggest whether Jinnah factored the waters in his partition plans. But then he never really visualized a divided Punjab. He wanted the entire Punjab, and therefore one can see that water did not really feature into his plans and thinking. In fact, there is a very interesting book, Islam in Modern History, in 1957, written by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and he talks about Jinnah, and he says, is it not perhaps time to bring into question his statesmanship, his political sagacity, in view of his apparent failure to foresee, apparently even to try to foresee, the concrete outworking of his proposals? One is left, and this is what Cantwell Smith says, one is left with the impression that he had never studied a map of the Punjab or Bengal, let alone envisaged the former's canal system. As compared to Jinnah and the Muslim League, the Congress leaders were decidedly more alert to the significance of the canals and the headworks. The perspectives of the civil engineers, and this is a very understudied part of our partition, the role of the civil engineers in determining the boundary and influencing Radcliffe, especially Sarup Singh, A.N. Khosla in the Punjab Irrigation Department, and Kanwar Sen in the Bikaner Irrigation Department. And they had together worked tirelessly to develop the canal system. And they played a very instrumental role in sensitizing the Congress political leadership to the criticality of utilization of the waters of the eastern rivers. And because of their effort and alertness, India regained the Firozpur headworks, which would have gone to West Punjab had the Radcliffe Award not been intervened upon. And because of their action, and because they had sensitized the political leadership, Nehru, Patel, Mountbatten, the boundary award maximized India's position. What was this maximization that came about? And there are some details here that I want to share. The eventual boundary award gave the headworks of the Upper Bari Doab Canal, the UBDC that is called, to East Punjab. If you look at the details here, the UBDC had two canal systems, namely the Central Bari Doab Canal and the Dipalpur Canal, with the headworks at Madhapur and at Firozpur. Both came to India, and these were critically, strategically very important headworks, because the distributaries of the CBDC and the Dipalpur were mostly in Pakistan, in West Punjab. And therefore, West Punjab became very dependent, extremely dependent, entirely dependent on the headworks in India. For West Punjab, having got the large share of the irrigated fields, as I had mentioned, that got 31 million acre of the 36 million acre irrigated land, the immediate problem was not the vastness of the irrigated field, but the immediate problem was to assure the continuity of water supplies to the UBDC. The boundary award also gave the control of the headworks of Ropar and Husainiwala on Satluj to East Punjab. Now, there is an enormous significance of the Firozpur headworks, which is not much articulated, I think, in the partition history of India. The Firozpur headworks was constructed back in the late 20s when the Satluj Valley project was being undertaken. And the beauty of this headwork is that it has 3 canals taking off from its location. One is the Dipalpur Canal, which is on the right side, and it irrigates Lahore and Mount Comrie district in Pakistan, and therefore you can understand the apprehension and the worry that Pakistan had on the Firozpur headwork. Then there is the Eastern Canal, which irrigates the larger area of Firozpur itself. And then there is the Bikaner Canal, which irrigates the northern part of the Bikaner state. But from a more security perspective, you must sort of know that the Firozpur headworks is the last point on the Satluj under India's jurisdiction. And it acts as a very important defense barrier. And we saw that in the wars that followed after the treaty was signed, 65 and 71. A very important defense barrier. Downstream to the headworks, the river meanders to form a common border. And therefore, we can really understand the angst over the Firozpur headworks that Pakistan always claimed, So this is something that I thought would bring this to the audience. The next historical context, and I must say that even today, when you look at some of the writings in Pakistan, they reflect on the Firozpur headworks, and they are completely in anguish that it was given to India, and they interpret their history of partition as the cunningness and the connivance of the British and the Indian leaders. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. The next context, the historical context, would be the Punjab Canal Waters dispute, and I think this actually sets the tone for the negotiations that started happening in 1952. I think April 1, 1948 is a very important date in the history of water dispute between India and Pakistan. And this is referred to as the Canal Waters dispute. The impact of the partition on the Pakistan irrigation system was probably felt for the first time with the expiry of the standstill agreements. Remember, the standstill agreements were signed soon after independence. And in December 1947, the chief engineers of East and West Punjab signed this standstill agreement, which related to the canal system, the CBDC, and the Firozpur barrage. Now, East Pakistan on 1st April, or rather East Punjab on April 1st, discontinued the delivery of waters to West Punjab. Now, several motives could be attributed to this action, but I think the most credible motive, and I count this in my book, seems to be East Punjab's legalistic assertion of an upper riparian, establishing its sovereign water rights. Remember, during the time of the partition and soon after, there was a very strong sub-nationalism which was seen throughout East Punjab. The mood in East Punjab was very provincial. It was rooted in the ground reality of water requirement. And in many ways, it did not reflect the lofty reconciliatory goals of Nehru. And Nehru was often troubled by some of the actions that took place in East Punjab. Moreover, I think East Punjab claimed, and this is a more technical explanation of why it stopped the waters, it claimed that West Punjab's had already agreed to pay the water dues as was governed by the Standstill Agreement of December 1947, which meant that it recognized India's proprietary rights, right? But Pakistan, insisted on the rights of prior allocation, and that the payments made were exclusively for the cost of maintaining and operating the irrigation work. So this is the kind of technical debate which goes on between East Punjab and West Punjab. Interestingly, while I talked about the engineers and their alertness to the canal system and the headworks, I must also state that the Advocate General of Punjab, Sir Mitra Sikri, who was one of the members of the International Law Association. And when this law association met in 1954 to inquire into the governing uses of international river, Sikri made a strong view about East Punjab's legalistic position. And I think this is again something which is underplayed and ignored, I think, in the partition history. His point of view was that core riparians on international rivers have no legal right to share in the waters. Their claims, and I quote him, being those only of comity based on good neighborliness, right? Which means that if you have a good relationship, I will share the water. But if you are a bad neighbor, I'm entitled to not even share the water with you. Of course, this is an argument that goes on in international law, and but this was a point which was being strongly highlighted by Sikri in the international forum. And Sikri was in fact citing the case of the US in 1895 to substantiate his claim. Remember, which is now famously called the Harmon Doctrine, the US Attorney General Harmon was defending the United States withdrawal of water that led to the reduction of flow of the Rio Grande at the Mexican border. And he concluded, and this is a very important principle which often upper riparians use, a country is absolutely sovereign over the portion of an international watercourse within its border. Now, his conclusion was based on the premise of absolute sovereignty of every nation within its own territory. And in his argument, Sikri was asserting, at least by implication, India's proprietary rights as an upstream country based on the fact that partition had created a new political boundary and gave it a priori basis. And he says, and this is a very interesting account which he notes in his diary, it could on one hand maintain that it had succeeded to the rights of British India as a sovereign state. On the other hand, India could assert that because there was no sovereign Pakistan before 1947, there could be no responsibility, therefore, of a successor state toward Pakistan. So the April 1 stoppage of water, in a certain way, was a rude awakening to Pakistan of its lower riparian vulnerability. War was certainly not an option for Pakistan then. It could have been fatal for Pakistan, as India had all the strategic advantages, including the critical headworks which supplied waters for about 5.5% of Pakistan's cropland. So there was a huge dependency of that water. What was alarming for Pakistan was also the fear that the Indian military offensive could result in the Mangla headworks, which controlled and supplied water from River Jhelum, falling into the control of India. And the Marla headworks, which was within a mile or so of the border, coming under threat. So at the end of the day, with war not a possibility for Pakistan, negotiation was thus the only option left. If you look at the literature around this period of time, the East Punjab and West Punjab, I think much of the literature, and this is Western literature, talks about East Punjab's discontinuation of water to the canals in West Punjab as Machiavellian. And I think this could not be further from the truth. And I've studied many of the wireless messages that was exchanged between East and West Punjab, which indicates that East Punjab did inform West Punjab of the standstill agreement, and there's a message exchange, and these messages clearly express that there was no duplicity, but it was well informed, and this is something that needs to be noted and emphasized in the history of the canal dispute. I think India called thereon for West Punjab to discuss what has been then described as a similar agreements and discuss this whole supply of water. Of course, West Punjab and Pakistan later used the whole situation of this stoppage as a very sound narrative that India is a bully country, that India continues to stop the water without any good cause, etc. And I think this narrative has run through 75 years of Pakistan's history, a narrative of being a vulnerable lower riparian country, a narrative of India being a irresponsible upper riparian country, issues of stoppage of water, etc. Of course, there was a certain motive, as I said. East Punjab was clearly had a sub-nationalism which was very passionate. It had undergone the partition difficulties, regime bloodshed. There was a certain different perspective in East Punjab about the waters. And there are some literature which sort of explains East Punjab's motive. For example, Jagat Mehta, who was the foreign secretary then, interestingly notes that the decision was entirely that of East Punjab, the stoppage of water, without the knowledge of the central government, thereby, in a certain sense, reducing it to a more localized administrative action of East Punjab. And much of this administrative localized action often irked Nehru, because Nehru was the Prime Minister of India. He wanted to reach out. Peace and stability was very important. Development was an outcome of peace and stability. I think many of the actions in East Punjab did sort of peeve Nehru. And there are lots of letters exchanged between the governor of East Punjab and Nehru, which you'll find in the book which I have come out with. After the Simla agreement, I think the Inter-Dominion Agreement in May, or the Delhi Agreement as it is called, was also a very important instrument of bringing the two countries together. I think the whole the politics between East Punjab and West Punjab then became between India and Pakistan. I think there was the whole issue of water now became a matter of two sovereign states. Obviously, the canal waters and the waters were becoming increasingly politicized, and a very divisive atmosphere was governing India and Pakistan. And Nehru, as a statesman, as a leader, repeatedly gave assurances of no harm and non-interference, and even a no-war declaration. But it had very little resonance in Pakistan, which unrelentingly baited India for its intention to undo the partition. As with the Kashmir issue, which was boiling up, the canal waters were also becoming a prelude to a third-party arbitration, without which Pakistan would not accept any even proposal. At this stage, I would also like to bring in the role of the Tennessee Valley Authority. I think a very important and a very influential role of this very remarkable institution. And it is very important in the context of the negotiation. The sweeping vision of the TVA, with its very technical and scientific application to social development, was very difficult to brush aside. And interestingly, in the Constituent Assembly debate, we find people like N.V. Gadgil, who was the Minister of Public Works. He emphasized a lot on water projects and the involvement of the best of minds in India's river valley projects. And he sent a letter to Sudhir Sen, the economic advisor in Moscow, to visit the Tennessee Valley Authority and study its management, its technicality. And you'll be surprised, even Meghnad Shah, the astrophysicist of India, who devoted himself to the flood management of the Damodar in Bengal, he also went and traveled to TV, and so did many Indian civil engineers at that point of time. The Tennessee Valley Authority was this remarkable institution. And the engineers saw in the field of engineering as advantageous for society and the national takeover project as a sort of a progression for the advancement of the modern state. And interestingly, even Dr. Ambedkar strongly believed in this modern state influenced by technology and advancement in water management. And when he was under Lord Wavell, the Viceroy of Finland, this is a few years before the partition, he was a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. And he had very sharply contested with the Viceroy over the appointment of the chief engineer who would plan and execute the Damodar Valley Corporation. Of course, Wavell was very prejudiced in picking up a British expert who had worked on the Aswan Dam. But Ambedkar challenged him, and Ambedkar suggested the expertise from the Tennessee Valley Authority. And you'll be surprised that at the end of the day, Ambedkar won and he prevailed. And with the result that you had a senior engineer called W.L. Vaudouin, who was a senior engineer of the TVA, and he was appointed to study the Damodar and make his recommendation in 1944. So with the TVA, obviously David Lilienthal, who was the chairman and who also later became the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, he came visiting India and he met Nehru in February, was it January? February 1951. And he walked the lawns of the Teen Murti, chatting and discussing with Nehru. And certainly he created a lasting impression. The TVA had become very popular in the imagination of the legislator. It had become a beacon for India's extensive water development projects. And he came to India and he came to India on a very personal capacity. He was no longer the chairman of TVA. He was no longer the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was on a visit on a personal capacity. He was here to survey and see the things. And he observed in his diaries that India presents the US in democracy and opportunity, such as we had missed in China 25 years ago. It is probably too late in China for us now, he says, but it is not too late in India. And this is a very important note he observes in his diary. And, before coming to India, Lilienthal, it was just not a private visit for a meditation purpose in India. He came with a certain objective, and he had met both Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State. He had also met President Truman on the importance of India and the problems in the US-India relationship, which Truman had described as a kind of unfriendliness that existed between India and the US. He had also met Walter Lippmann, who was, remember, the founder editor of the New Republic. And some of you might know his very famous book, The Public Opinion, which was published in 1922, is even today regarded as the most persuasive critique of democracy. So it was Lippmann who actually, and by the way, Lippmann was the first to have introduced the concept of Cold War. And Lippmann had briefed Lilienthal on some of the key critical issues between India and Pakistan, particularly on Kashmir. And at the very core of Kashmir, the struggle over rivers, the headworks in Kashmir. And I think Lilienthal was well informed for all this. And after visiting both the Prime Ministers, Nehru and Liaquat in Pakistan, Lilienthal goes back to the US and publishes 2 articles for the Colliers. And these are very interesting articles. One is titled, Are We Losing India? In which actually he concludes that Nehru represents democracy's last hope against another major reversal for democracy in Asia. And therefore, it is critically important for the United States to help India as a modern nation. The second the article, again very interesting, was titled Another Korea in the Making, which describes more the India-Pakistan relationship on Kashmir and the Indus water. And it throws open a proposal, and it argues in the article that one way to reduce hostility, that is over Kashmir, was to concentrate on other important issues where cooperation was possible. And then the article goes on and suggests that India and Pakistan work out a program to jointly develop and jointly operate the Indus Basin. Interestingly, this jointness reminds you of Radcliffe's own proposal, right, when he suggested that to Jinnah and Nehru. And here we are, a few years later, the Lilienthal, stressing on jointly develop and jointly operate the Indus Basin with new dams and irrigation canals, etc., etc. This article also, I think, suggested that the World Bank might use its good offices to bring the two parties to agreement and help the financing of the Indus Basin Development Program. And this is where now the World Bank, starts making its inroads into.
Uttamji, if I may interrupt, we have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, and it comes into the play of the negotiations, and it's very interesting to observe the role itself. On the negotiation, there are 2 periods which you must look at. One is 1952 to 56, where India and Pakistan make their proposals, right? But it enters into a logjam. There is a lot of unnecessary dialogue, which is unproductive. And then the period from 1956 to 1960, where actually the bank makes its own proposal. And finally, to answer that question, which was what was the incentive that drove India and Pakistan into agreeing, I would think the most important element was what is called the World Bank throwing its money into the larger development of the Indus Basin. When the World Bank brought in these 2 countries together into a possible agreement based on the principles of equitable and fairness, it was all because there was a certain financial objective to it. And the whole price of developing the Indus Basin was, of quite a fantastic amount. And the initial price was that $250 million as India's contribution towards the cost of water project to be built in Pakistan. But India had set its limit on the range of 158 million. So there is a whole lot of money that was involved. And the World Bank had become, for Pakistan, a financial guarantor, undertaking to underwrite the entire cost of a water development work, etc. So, in effect, what the US and what the World Bank, with of course the US administration playing a very subtle role, what it did was to bring in what is called financial muscle into getting both these 2 parties together and eventually signing the treaty. So let me conclude by saying a few things. It is said generally that an international treaty that gives one party all that it wants cannot be a good treaty. So like all treaties, the Indus Water Treaty was in a certain sense a compromise. India as an upper riparian could have chosen not to sign the treaty and use the waters unilaterally. Remember, Nehru in 1947 had said that India would use its water as it pleased. There were, however, compulsions that India could not ignore. There was a compulsion, there was international community, there was Nehru's own vision and idea. And had the treaty not been signed, I think, and this is very important, much of the socio-economic development plans in India would have been stymied and tensions would have just continued. It cannot be denied that the signing of the treaty became possible because of the timely intervention of the World Bank and the sort of pressures of the US. So I think both India and Pakistan desperately required financial assistance for their development projects. And the World Bank found itself as a very influential player here, found itself in a very influential group. Even before the negotiation began, I think the World Bank had told India to resolve its canal water dispute with Pakistan before it financed the Bhakra-Nangal project. And this is something quite important, how the World Bank plays it. The question is as to whether India compromises upper riparian position more than actually required is something that we raise in retrospect. Water was critical for India's development plans, its irrigation facilities and power. It was crucial, therefore, to get the waters of the eastern rivers for the proposed Rajasthan Canal and the Bhakra Dam. So I think it had its merit, and a lot of issues, of course, re-emerge here. But what I can say finally is that the treaty still survives. It is 62 years of uninterrupted functioning. A few months ago, only in March, the Indus Water Commissioners met for the 117th time, and that's quite remarkable. And one can argue that the treaty, in some sense, has outlived its utility, and a new arrangement probably is needed. But one thing is certain, whatever be the treaty of the future, it is for sure that the more than favorable outcome that Pakistan achieved in 1960 can certainly not be repeated again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uttamji, for this very comprehensive, enlightening lecture on this important subject. We are now open to questions and comments. Yes, Mr. Gautam Sen, have you raised your hand?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you, Sinha for a very nice, detailed, and perceptive lecture. I think I got a conclusion from you that the treaty was the best in the existing circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, one point: the hydrology of the basin, entire basin, since it was concluded in 1960, has undergone a substantial change. In such a change, how do you visualize? I mean, what had been the fallout to the extent of India gaining more or Pakistan gaining less or whatever it is? I mean, some sort of an assessment have you attempted, or do you think would be worthwhile in the context of drastic change in hydrology, climatic changes, etc., which has occurred over the last so many years, 60 plus years? Thank you.
Yes, shall we take a few more questions, or do you want Dr. Mishra to respond immediately?
You can go ahead, probably.
Yeah. No, this is indeed a very interesting question that you asked. It's a question of concern. The hydrology doesn't remain stable. What was available 62 years ago, obviously because of the excessive demand and the expanding population, which is now almost around about 300 million people on the entire Indus basin, including India and Pakistan. The demand is putting great pressure on the supply itself. Then there is both the known and the unknown factors of climate change, which has great impact on both the flow pattern of the rivers as well as what is called the groundwater storage capacity. So these are challenges, obviously, and therefore the point which I concluded by saying that probably the Indus basin the Indus basin, the Indus Waters Treaty has outlasted its utility, something that brings in all these elements into it. Now, it is not easy to have another treaty or have another arrangement or have another regime on the Indus basin. I don't think there could be another Indus Water Treaty ever in the future. But we do need to consider the new knowledge and the new factors into the basin and plan what and how we should manage the basin in the future. I think one element that comes across, and of course that requires a lot of political acumenship and sagacity, is again the joint approach to water management. And I keep repeating this joint because it actually starts from Radcliffe's own proposal of joint management of the system to even today, when we look at some of these existential challenges that emerge, what could be areas of joint cooperation between India and Pakistan on the Indus basin? Knowledge exchange, finding studies on glaciers, flood management. And remember, in fact, even the Indus Waters Treaty, while it does not have an exit clause, it does talk about future cooperation. And I think this is something probably we need to think about in the future cooperation. Remember, the Indus Water Commissioners meet regularly, once a year definitely. And I think that Indus Water Commissioner is an important platform here to raise some of these critical issues of water management. I think also, and you rightly point out, Mr. Sen, that the hydrological assessment has to be done much more carefully, which means satellite mapping of the basin has to be done. to evaluate critically what is the water footprint in the basin itself, how much has it reduced, especially the water tables, the underground water tables in particular. Also, in terms of water management issues, in the way we engage with food production, the way we have done in the past, probably is not the way in the future, with water resources being limited now in the basin. New practices, new technology, new knowledge, new shift into different variety of agriculture would also be quite important. So, I mean, history always reminds us and tells us and teaches us. The Indus Valley had prospered because of the Indus Basin and the Indus Basin waters. It also perished because of the basin. And I think when we look ahead and plan our actions on the Indus Basin, we have to factor a greater amount of water management issues, and which also means that we have to factor both the countries in this planning process. Whether the politics will allow it is something that we have to see.
We have another question from here. Please switch on the mic.
After 61 years of treaty, still Pakistan is complaining about full compliance of the treaty repeatedly, while India is very much clear that it says that all projects are full compliant. Where is the problem? Why Pakistan is repeating such type of thing? Where is the key issue from Pakistan side?
We have another question also. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Sinha, for this very enlightening talk for a lot of us who do not know, so much about this issue. In fact, I'm quite intrigued by the way this complex issue, the complexity of the dispute has been handled in a diplomatic fashion, over these years, more than 60 years, and over 3 wars which have been fought between the two nations. My question is actually slightly, looking towards the east, to the other border of India. What is is there a similar situation with the sharing of the Brahmaputra borders? Because, with the emerging, the China, Pakistan nexus, and the fact that there's another river where we have to probably deal with 3 countries, there is Bangladesh also. So what has happened, if you could tell us in brief, if a similar trajectory is also available there, or is there a history of any dispute or cooperation over the waters of Brahmaputra? Thank you.
Right. Well, let me answer Amit's question first. Why does Pakistan behave the way it does? Well, largely it is a very carefully thought of narrative of a lower riparian. Lower riparians around the world tend to create a victimhood around water sharing. And it gets a very huge audience, internationally. People tend to sympathize, as a low riparian country. Especially if you have this adversarial relationship with a much more bigger and powerful country, India, which is an upper riparian. I think that that narrative sells very widely. And I think Pakistan has crafted this very well. Remember, it is very good at lobbying in the United States. It creates situations of hurt, victimhood, and creates a situation which is almost near being a flashpoint. Waters will lead to war, water would lead to nuclear destruction, etc. And suddenly you find South Asia as a tinderbox. Remember, Eisenhower, in his administration, was worried about this, that South Asia being a tinderbox, another Korea. And it is the same, sort of elements that bring in a lot of Western attention to the Indus Basin. And just to answer that with Soumya's question, remarkably, it has survived all the 3 wars without any disruption. So I think it does, in a certain sense, suggests that India's diplomacy on the river waters with its neighborhood countries, is quite balanced, stable, well thought through, and very few Western countries give that credit to India. Remember, the Indus Water Treaty is a partitioning treaty, right? Our water relationship with Nepal is more benefit sharing sort of arrangement. With Bangladesh, it is purely sharing of the waters, right? With Brahmaputra, since we are the lower riparian and we are completely opposite to what we are in the Indus Basin, we don't have any arrangements. There's no institutional mechanism except for what is called a memorandum of understanding with China. Again, here it shows that India, in its water relationship with all its neighboring countries, does engage in what is called good cooperation, responsibility, elements of generosity. I think these are important elements of India in the regional diplomacy with its neighborhood. When the Indus Basin was being discussed and debated, on the east there was something called the Faraka that emerged. And if you look at that period of time and study the negotiating process, we were far more engaging, far more probably generous, far more giving on the Indus Basin than we were on the Faraka barrage. Right. And I think quite clearly the Indus Basin mattered a lot in the early 50s, late 50s, early 60s. The entire water development project was quite important. And therefore this whole emphasis on the eastern rivers was very critical for India. I think we can, of course, in retrospect, criticize the negotiators, but I think they looked at the immediate interest there, and the immediate interest was the Bhakra-Nangal Dam, etc. And but India's overall approach is fashioned by talks and negotiation on the rivers, and we've seen that through all its neighboring countries. Again, in contrast, China does not believe in what is called treaties, or or definitely not water sharing treaties. Very few countries in the world have water sharing treaties. You know, the formula of giving away so much of water, simply because water is such a precious resource. But I think India has been quite unique in this way in its larger regional diplomacy to have water sharing agreements. Even with the Indus, though it's partitioning, the water sharing is strongly reflected, 80-20%. With Bangladesh, again, there is a water sharing arrangement month by month. So I think, yeah, it's a unique riparian country. It's a powerful riparian country because India is an upper riparian with Pakistan. It is an upper riparian with Bangladesh. But I think it believes more in hydro cooperation, hydro diplomacy, and it has to, given the South Asia geographical sort of existence where actually rivers connect all the neighborhood. Such an approach is practical and pragmatic. Yeah.
Any other question? Okay, we'll wait for other questions. There was one question or observation from my side. Uh, as Dr. Soumya here raised this issue of a comparison between the Northwest and the East, and you rightly clarified that, of course, there is a fundamental difference between the situations. We don't have the kind of proper, elaborate water sharing treaty in the East as compared to what we have in the West. And you also observed that India has generally been generous when it comes to sharing of water with other countries. But isn't there also another fundamental difference between water in the Northwest and water in the East? because it's here that from the middle of the 19th century, this vast canal irrigation network, as you said, if I heard it correctly, it covered about 37 million acres
Acre.
of land.
Mm,
So which was huge. It was the largest canal irrigation system in the world.
true.
And the fact is that it was a part of building up a base of loyalty from within the country, and also of a part of their international politics. You know,
Mm,
so water was a much more politicized thing, I would say, in
mm,
what was then the United Punjab,
yeah.
and therefore it is very natural that Nehru and others uh, and people in Pakistan, they were anxious to have a well-defined sort of, arrangement for the sharing of the water, because the economy on both sides
Mm,
depended much more on this
mm,
irrigation network in the
mm,
northwest than
yeah.
it depended, say, in Bengal or Assam or Bihar, because those regions had not developed this kind of irrigation network at all. So
Yes.
water was more of a, how should I put it, an unpredictable presence. Its
True.
absence could lead to a drought, and
Yeah.
its excess could lead to a
Mm,
flood. But that kind of situation did not exist in the northwest. So
yeah.
because water was such a politicized kind of commodity here in the northwest, probably this also helped in inducing both the parties in coming to an arrangement like this. And probably India also thought that, I mean, in the last 60 years, when we fought three wars with Pakistan, we still sort of adhered to the treaty. There was no violation. Maybe one reason was that this water sharing was seen as so existential a thing to Pakistan that India's sort of violation of the treaty
Yeah.
would have been seen as too big a sort of provocation to Pakistan. What do you think about this?
Well, I would agree uh, quite on what you just said. The Indus Basin is just not the partition and the Indus Waters Treaty. It has a history which goes far, far back. History of canal development, history of new knowledge coming in terms of water management. It takes you all the way back to the Indus Valley civilization. So yeah, it is inherited and it is acquired. The political legitimacy, the water management knowledge, it has all been acquired. Such even the administrative reforms and the rules and the protocols that happened between the provinces and the princely states in terms of water sharing was all acquired and brought at the time of the partition. And therefore, what happened in the negotiation period was essentially an acquired knowledge of the past that had to be reshaped and that had to be technically expressed through engineers and had to be arranged to finances to develop the optimal potential of the Indus basin. The whole idea, remember, was that while the canals developed and irrigated 36 million acre of land, remember the potential was enormous. It could actually develop 46 million acre more of land. And that is why the whole interest in the basin emerged. And that is why the Tennessee Valley Authority, the whole idea of water management and development became absolutely enticing. And remember, it is also a strategic belt. It is a strategic zone. The entire Punjab, Pakistan, Afghanistan is a strategic zone. It is what the Britishers described as a panic zone for them. And therefore the stability of that region in the international order of things is also very critical. The only difference between the Indus Basin and the rivers in the east was that the Indus Basin never eventually concentrated on navigation on Indian waterways. They tried to with the Britishers early on, but it never happened. Whereas inland navigation on the eastern rivers are far more viable. It has a greater historical depth to it and a greater historical understanding to it. In fact, if you look at the Gazetteer of India notification in 1903 or 1904, I forget, it actually describes the waterways of the Brahmaputra as the national highways. That's a very important, it actually had foreseen the value of inland navigation and the movement of goods and material and human beings and transportation through these rivers. The rivers are incredibly fascinating. And look at India. I see the South Asia as a riverine neighborhood. You can't have cooperation or regional diplomacy without not paying attention to the rivers. So I think it's a critical element of bilateral relationship, is a critical element of sub-regional cooperation.
Two further small questions arise out of what you just said. One is you again mentioned the fact that this thing, the ecological decline theory of Indus civilization, of course, is very, very important. And if I remember correctly, Wittfogel presented a very, very powerful sort of argument in this regard. And what intrigues me is whether there was any sort of reference to the decline of Indus civilization while the treaty was being negotiated between India and Pakistan. Was there an awareness of history going that far back? Because the fact is that northwestern India is a semi-arid region, and in a semi-arid region, water is probably the most important resource, unlike in the east, which is, of course, which receives far more precipitation. So was there a memory on both sides, or on one side?
No, I don't think so. There was any reference to the ecological aspect. Remember, you were dealing with civil engineers. You were dealing with an institution called the Tennessee Valley Authority. You were dealing with intensive technology of water management. The principles was laid out very clearly. Development was the agenda. Larger food production was the agenda, because it clearly meant uplifting the people out of their squalor and poverty. So obviously there wasn't any room for sort of leisure discussion on the ecological impact and the environmental impact. And remember, we are in times of the 50s and 60s. Of course, the Indus Valley is very instructive in many ways, but there wasn't any reference to that. You were dealing with a very clinical engineering mindset, both indigenous also, because remember, we had our own civil engineers who were, of course, clearly they were trained through a sort of British institution, and they were very clear about the very principles of what water meant. So yes, the fundas were very clear of what rivers meant and what water meant. In fact, that is, it's an irony actually, if you look at the very fact that the World Bank came in, because it didn't have the political ideology or the appeal in the political framework of India. So it's very interesting, but it was thanks to the civil engineers and their sort of to and fro movement and the relationship with the scientific community and the civil engineers in America that brought this great sort of river valley projects and the development of water. It's something quite fascinating and also very ironical. And as I said, even Ambedkar, he clearly believed that any social development would require high technology and driven water resource management. And had it not been for him, the DVC might not have probably come about. So yeah, this is something we must understand, that the rivers in that period of time was clearly viewed as in terms of harnessing, in terms of utilizing the benefit for the larger number of people. And for Indian engineers, I think US was the child of modern engineering. It had successfully integrated science and technology to the needs of society by harnessing the rivers. Remember, it was cheap and renewable. That was the driving force behind water development. Cheap and renewable energy that will help you, enhance the food production.
Um, is there any other question from anyone? No, I cannot. All right, then we come to an end of this discussion. I'm very, very thankful to all the members of the audience for their participation this afternoon. And I'm very thankful to Dr. Sinha, our speaker today, for his presence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Take care.